Humans shock the Galactic Council by rejecting negotiation. Part 2. The Arrival at Nexus Prime. Nexus Prime was the largest structure anyone had ever built. It was a station the size of a small moon, floating in the empty dark between 3 star systems. And it had taken hundreds of species, thousands of years to finish it. Its surface was covered with docking rings, communication towers, observation domes, and landing platforms that stretched on for miles. Thousands of ships came and went every day. Millions of beings from every corner of the galaxy lived and worked inside its walls. It was the capital of galactic civilization, and it was designed from the ground up to make visitors feel very, very small. Ambassador Luke Hadley had studied every piece of information available about Nexus Prime during the 3-week journey from Earth. He had read about the architecture, the protocols, the history. He knew that the corridors leading to the council chamber were built with ceilings 300 meters high on purpose. He knew that the walls were lined with holographic murals showing the council's greatest achievements. Wars ended, species saved, civilizations brought into the fold. It was all designed to remind anyone walking those halls that the council was bigger, older, and more powerful than whatever problem they had brought with them. He knew all of this, and it still took his breath away when he walked through those doors. The human delegation had not arrived quietly. Captain Danny Hargrove had brought the Steadfast, and flanking it were 2 more cruisers, the Ironclad and the Gallant. 3 warships, bristling with weapons, parked right in the middle of the diplomatic docking zone. It was not subtle. It was not supposed to be. Danny had argued for the show of force during the planning meetings. These species respect power, he had told Hadley. If we show up in a shuttle, they'll see us as weak. If we show up with guns, they'll at least take us seriously. Hadley had not disagreed. Now the ambassador walked through the towering corridors with his delegation behind him. Katie Pruitt was at his right side, her dress uniform pressed sharp, her sidearms sitting clearly visible on her hip. 2 Volani guards at the entrance to the chamber complex had stared at the weapon. They had looked at each other. They had looked at the 3 human warships visible through the station's transparent hull panels. They had decided not to say anything. General Megan Holt walked on Hadley's left. She had insisted on coming, even though her presence was unusual for a diplomatic mission. If they're going to threaten us with military force, she had said before they left Earth, I want them to look me in the eye when they do it. It was shaped like an amphitheater, with tiered seats rising up in great circles around a central platform. Every seat was filled. Over 300 species, 300 different shapes and sizes and colors, all watching as the small group of humans walked down the long ramp to the center of the room. Hadley took it all in. The Krithani were there, insect-like creatures with sharp mandibles and compound eyes that reflected the light in shimmering patterns. They were clicking softly among themselves, their translators producing a low hum of conversation. The Morathi, beings made of something that looked like living gelatin, shifted colors as the humans passed, turning shades of blue and purple that the translator notes said indicated curiosity and anxiety. The Drashan sat in their section like statues carved from dark stone, their reptilian eyes following every step the humans took. And above them all, on an elevated platform at the very top of the chamber, sat High Arbiter Zorath. His silver skin glowed softly under the chamber lights, and his 6 eyes looked down at the approaching humans with the calm, patient expression of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Welcome, representatives of humanity, Zorath said. His voice filled the chamber, carried by speakers hidden in every wall. The Council is pleased that you have accepted our invitation to resolve this territorial matter through the honored tradition of mediated negotiation. Hadley stepped onto the central platform. It was a circle of polished metal, about 20 meters across, and standing on it felt like standing at the bottom of a well with 300 species looking down from the rim. He could feel the weight of their attention, the pressure of 9,000 years of tradition pushing down on his shoulders. He took a breath. "Thank you, High Arbiter," he said. His voice was steady, and the translators carried it to every ear and receptor in the chamber. "But I need to correct something before we begin. We did not come here to negotiate." The murmur that went through the chamber was like a wave. It started in the lower tiers and rolled upward, species after species, reacting to words they had never heard spoken in this room before. The Krythani clicking grew louder. The Morathi turned bright orange, which the notes said meant shock. Even the Drashin moved, their heavy tails shifting on the stone benches. Zorath's 6 eyes blinked, one after another, in a slow sequence. "I'm sorry, Ambassador. Could you repeat that?" "We did not come here to negotiate," Hadley said again. "We came here to explain our position and to make a counter-proposal." "A counter-proposal," Zorath repeated, as if the words were in a language his translator couldn't handle. "The Korath corridor was empty when our people found it," Hadley continued. "We checked every database, every record, every registry. There were no claims, no markers, no beacons, nothing. Our people moved in, built colonies, started families, and created a home. 11 years of work, 800,000 lives. And now we're being told to leave because the Torathi say their ancestors passed through that space 600 years ago." He paused and looked up at the tiers of watching faces. "We've studied your Section 47. We've read every case where it was applied, and in every single case, the species that was already living in the disputed territory was told to pack up and go. It didn't matter how long they had been there. The older claim always won." The Torathi ambassador rose from the upper tiers. It was a tall being, shaped something like a praying mantis, with long folded wings that shimmered with color. "The corridor is part of our ancestral heritage," the Torathi said through the translator. "Our forebears traveled that route during the Great Migration. It is woven into our cultural identity. Your settlements are built on sacred ground." Hadley looked up at the Torathi ambassador. "I hear you," he said, and he meant it. "I understand that the corridor has deep meaning for your people, and if all you wanted was to preserve that history, to build monuments or memorial sites along your ancestors' route, we would help you do it. We would protect those sites. We would teach our children about the Torathi migration. That is not the problem." His voice hardened just slightly. "The problem is that you are asking us to remove 800,000 people from the only homes they have. Children, people who have nowhere else to go. And the Council is telling us that this is fair because your claim is older." He turned back to Zorath. "We are here to propose a different path. Shared access to the corridor. The Torathi establish cultural heritage sites wherever they wish along the ancestral route. We protect and maintain those sites jointly. We open trade agreements, cultural exchanges, and scientific cooperation between our peoples. We build something together instead of tearing something apart." Zorath listened. His silver face gave away nothing. "And the one thing that is not on the table," Hadley said, "is the removal of our people. That will not happen. Not today, not ever." The chamber was so quiet that Hadley could hear the hum of the station's power systems through the floor. Zorath leaned forward. "Ambassador Hadley, the Council does not accept counter-proposals from summoned parties. That is not how this process works. You have been summoned to receive the Council's ruling, not to challenge it." Hadley nodded. He had expected this. "Then, with respect, High Arbiter, the process needs to change." Something shifted in the chamber. It was not a sound exactly, more like a feeling, the sense of something very old and very heavy beginning to crack. 300 species watched the humans standing alone on the central platform. And for the first time in 9,000 years, They saw something they had never seen before. They saw someone who was not afraid. General Holt stepped up beside Hadley. She did not speak for long. She did not need to. "We are not here to make threats," she said. "We are here to be honest. Humanity will not abandon its people. If the Council cannot accept that, then we have a problem. But it is not a problem that we created." Zorath stared at the two humans on the platform below him. His silver skin dimmed, which the translator said meant deep displeasure. But there was something else in his 6 eyes, something that the translators could not name. It looked almost like doubt. "This session is suspended," Zorath said. "The Council will deliberate." The humans turned and walked back up the ramp, through the towering corridors, past the murals of 9,000 years of unchallenged authority, and back to their ships. Humans shock the Galactic Council by rejecting negotiation. Part 3. The Weight of Refusal. The Council deliberated for 6 hours. During that time, Ambassador Hadley sat in the small quarters assigned to the human delegation aboard Nexus Prime and drank 3 cups of tea. He did not eat. He did not sleep. He sat at a desk with a datapad in front of him and read through every scrap of intelligence humanity had ever gathered about the Council's enforcement history. It was not encouraging reading. The last time the Council had authorized enforcement action against a species, it had been the Galori, a proud civilization of avian beings who had refused to hand over a weapons technology the Council deemed too dangerous. The Council had blockaded their home system for 2 years. When the Galori still refused, the Council fleet moved in. The war lasted 11 days. The Galori surrendered unconditionally. Their weapons technology was confiscated. Their military was disbanded. Their species was placed under Council supervision for the next 300 years. That had been 4,000 years ago. No species had needed to be disciplined since, because the Galori example hung over every civilization in the galaxy like a shadow. Step out of line, and the Council will break you. Everyone knew it. Everyone remembered. Hadley set the datapad down and rubbed his tired eyes. He wondered, not for the first time, if he was leading humanity into the same trap. The door chimed, and Katie Pruitt stepped in. She looked at his face and sat down across from him without being invited. "You're thinking about the Galori," she said. "Am I that obvious? You're reading their case file. It's not hard to figure out." She leaned back in her chair. "The Galori were alone. We don't have to be." Before Hadley could respond, the station's communication system announced that the Council session would resume in 1 hour. Hadley straightened his tie, finished his tea, and walked back into the chamber that was trying to decide his species' future. The mood had changed. The murmuring curiosity from earlier was gone, replaced by something colder. The Krithani sat in rigid silence, their mandibles still. The Marathi had turned a flat, neutral gray, showing nothing. The Drashan watched with their usual stone-faced attention, but there was a sharpness to it now, the look of predators scenting something in the air. Zorath stood on his elevated platform. He did not sit. That was unusual, and Hadley noticed it immediately. "The Council has deliberated," Zorath said. His voice was harder than before, the warmth of diplomatic courtesy stripped away. "We have reviewed humanity's counter proposal. We have discussed it at length. And the Council's position is as follows." He paused, and every eye and sensor in the chamber locked onto him. "The Tarathi claim to the Korath Corridor is valid under Section 47 of the Interstellar Accord. The Council's ruling is that all human settlements in the corridor must be evacuated within 90 standard rotations. All mining operations must cease. All infrastructure must be surrendered to the Tarathi. This ruling is final and binding." Hadley felt the words hit him like stones, one after another. 90 days. 90 days to move 800,000 people. to tell families that their homes, their schools, the gardens they had planted in alien soil, all of it belonged to someone else now. He opened his mouth to speak, but Zorath was not finished. Furthermore, the High Arbiter continued, in light of humanity's unprecedented refusal to engage in good-faith negotiation, the Council has voted to impose immediate economic sanctions. All human vessels are hereby barred from Council-controlled trade routes and transit corridors. All trade agreements between human entities and Council member species are suspended, effective immediately. The chamber was silent, except for the soft hum of translators working overtime. And finally, Zorath said, and his voice dropped to a tone that was almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. The Council wishes to remind humanity that enforcement protocols exist for situations where sanctions fail to produce compliance. We sincerely hope it does not come to that. The threat, wrapped in silk but made of steel. Hadley stood on the central platform and felt the weight of 300 species watching him. He could feel their expectation. Every single one of them had been in this position at some point in their history. Standing before the Council, hearing the ruling, swallowing the bitter pill. Every single one of them had said yes, had bowed their heads, had gone home and done what they were told. He thought about the Galori. 11 days. That was how long it had taken the Council to crush a civilization that had dared to refuse. Then he thought about his daughter. She was 12 years old and lived on Earth with her mother. She had sent him a message before he left for Nexus Prime. It said, "Be brave, Dad." Hadley took a breath. "High Arbiter," he said, and his voice was calm. "Humanity has heard the Council's ruling, and with the deepest respect for this institution and its history, we cannot accept it." The chamber did not erupt this time. It went still. Completely, absolutely still. As if 300 species had simultaneously stopped breathing. "We cannot accept it," Hadley continued, "because it asks us to treat 800,000 human lives as less important than a 600-year-old travel route. Because it asks us to uproot families and destroy communities for a principle that values the past over the present. And because accepting it would tell every species in this galaxy that the Council's word is beyond question, beyond challenge, and beyond change." He looked up at Zorath. "You say this ruling is final, but a ruling that displaces 800,000 innocent people without their consent, without any compromise, without even considering an alternative, that is not justice. That is power pretending to be justice." Something moved in the upper tiers. The Tarathi ambassador rose again, wings flaring with agitation. "You insult the Council with your arrogance. You are a young species. You have been among the stars for barely 2 centuries. You know nothing of the traditions and laws that hold this galaxy together." Hadley looked at the Tarathi. "You're right," he said simply. "We are young. We are new to all of this. And maybe that's exactly why we can see what older species have learned to ignore. Your system is not fair. It has never been fair. It has simply been obeyed. And obedience is not the same thing as fairness." General Holt, standing behind Hadley, watched the chamber carefully. She was counting ships in her head. The Council fleet numbered over 10,000 warships. Humanity had maybe 400 combat-ready vessels in total. But Holt had fought in bad situations before, and she knew something that numbers alone could not tell you. Numbers didn't measure willingness to fight. The Drashan section of the chamber caught her eye. The big reptilians were not reacting like the other species. They were not shocked, or outraged, or afraid. They were watching the humans with something that looked almost like recognition. Like they were seeing something they remembered from a long time ago. One of the Drashan, a scarred veteran with a cybernetic eye, met Holt's gaze across the chamber. He held it for a long moment. Then he dipped his heavy head, just slightly, in what might have been a nod. Holt filed that away for later. Zorath spoke again. Ambassador Hadley, I urge you to reconsider. The path you are choosing leads to isolation at best, and destruction at worst. The Council does not wish to see humanity harmed. But the Accord must be upheld. The Accord can be reformed, Hadley said. Rules that were written 9,000 years ago do not have to stay the same forever. The galaxy has changed, species have changed. The Council should change with them. That is not for you to decide, Zorath said. Then who decides? Hadley asked. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like the Council decides everything, and everyone else just follows along. That's not governance, that's control. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Hadley had ever heard. Zorath's silver skin flickered through several patterns, emotions too complex for the translator to fully decode. Then the High Arbiter straightened to his full height, all 6 eyes fixed on the small human standing far below him. So be it, he said. The sanctions will take effect immediately. The Council will monitor the situation in the Korath Corridor, and humanity will bear the consequences of its choice. The session ended. Hadley walked out of the chamber on legs that felt like they were made of water. Katie Pruitt fell into step beside him, and for a while, neither of them spoke. They walked through the enormous corridors, past the murals, past the guards, past all the grand symbols of an order that had just been challenged for the first time in 9,000 years. That went about as well as I expected, Hadley said quietly. Katie looked at him. You were incredible in there. I was terrified in there. Same thing sometimes. They kept walking. Behind them in the great chamber, 300 species sat in their seats and tried to understand what had just happened. Most of them were confused. Some were angry. A few were frightened. And in the Drashan section, the scarred warrior with the cybernetic eye leaned over to the commander beside him and said, in a low voice that the translators did not catch, "Send a message to the sovereignty. Tell them it has begun." Humans shock the Galactic Council by rejecting negotiation. Part 4. The Line in the Stars. The sanctions hit like a hammer. Within 48 hours of the Council's announcement, every human trade agreement with every Council species was frozen. Cargo ships carrying food, medicine, and industrial materials were turned away from stations they had been visiting for years. Transit corridors that human vessels had used to move between star systems were suddenly closed, their navigation beacons reprogrammed to reject human ship codes. The galactic economy had thousands of threads connecting hundreds of species, and the Council reached in and cut every single thread that touched humanity. On Earth, the effects were felt almost immediately. Prices for rare materials used in ship construction and medical equipment tripled overnight. Supply chains that depended on Council space imports broke apart. News networks ran the story around the clock, and opinion was split right down the middle. Half the population thought the government had made the bravest decision in human history. The other half thought they had just signed a species death warrant. Admiral Nolan Briggs did not have time for opinion polls. He was in the command center beneath the Rocky Mountains, and he had not slept in 2 days. The tactical displays around him showed a picture that was getting worse by the hour. The Council was assembling a fleet at the edge of the Korath Corridor. Ships were arriving from all across Council space, warships from a dozen different species, each one answering the call to enforce the Council's will. 200 warships in the first count. The number kept growing. "They're not just trying to scare us," General Holt said, standing beside him with her arms crossed and her jaw set. "That's a real invasion force." Briggs nodded. "What do we have in the corridor?" 34 combat-ready ships. Captain Hargrove has the Steadfast, the Ironclad, and the Gallant on the front line. The rest are a mix of frigates, patrol ships, and arms transports. Another 12 ships are on their way from Sol, but they won't arrive for at least 10 days. 46 against 200, Briggs said. And counting, Holt added. More council ships are still arriving. Briggs stared at the display. He thought about the 800,000 people behind those 46 ships. He thought about what would happen to them if the council fleet came through. The Galori had surrendered after 11 days. Humanity might not last that long. But giving up meant giving up everything, not just the corridor. If they backed down now, the council would know that threats worked. And they would keep threatening, keep pushing, keep taking, until humanity was nothing more than another obedient voice in the chamber, saying yes to whatever they were told. Hold the line, Briggs said quietly. Whatever it takes, we hold the line. Out in the corridor, Captain Danny Hargrove was thinking the same thing. He stood on the bridge of the Steadfast, watching the sensor display paint the growing council fleet in red dots along the corridor's outer boundary. Each dot was a warship. Each warship was crewed by beings who had been told that the humans were lawbreakers, rebels, a threat to galactic order. Katie Pruitt walked up beside him and handed him a cup of coffee. He took it without looking away from the display. 214 now, she said. I can count. Just making sure. Despite everything, Danny almost smiled. The communication console chimed. Danny expected another message from High Command. Or maybe another ultimatum from the Council. Instead, the face that appeared on the screen was one he had never seen before. It was Drashan, a species of large, powerful reptilians known for their military tradition and their long memories. This particular Drashan was heavily scarred. One of his eyes had been replaced with a cybernetic implant that glowed a steady amber. He looked like someone who had seen a lot of fighting and intended to see a lot more. Captain Hargrove, the Drashan said, I am War Leader Kesson of the Drashan Sovereignty. Danny straightened. The Drashan were a council member species. If they were calling him, it could mean anything from a warning to a declaration of war. War Leader, Danny said carefully, this is unexpected. Kesson made a sound that the translator rendered as a dry laugh. I imagine it is. The Drashan Sovereignty has been watching your situation since your ambassador spoke before the council. I was in the chamber that day. I saw your people stand on that platform and refuse to bend. He paused. His amber eye glowed brighter for a moment. 3,000 years ago, the Drashan were in the same position. We had settled a system rich in minerals. Another species claimed it based on ancestral rights. The council ruled against us. We were told to leave. And we did, because we were alone, and the council fleet was 10 times the size of ours. Kesson leaned forward. We have regretted that decision for 3,000 years. It was the greatest shame in our history, and every Drashan warrior carries the weight of it. When I watched your ambassador say no to the High Arbiter, I felt something I have not felt in a very long time. What was that? Danny asked. Hope, Kesson said simply. Hope that someone would finally have the courage to do what we could not. He straightened in his seat. The Drashan Sovereignty is prepared to deploy 40 warships to the Korath corridor. They are already on their way. They will arrive within 6 days. Danny stared at the screen. He felt something loosen in his chest, a knot of fear he had been carrying since the council fleet first appeared on his sensors. War Leader, he said. Why? You know what this could cost your people. Kesson's scarred face was hard. Because the council's authority rests on one thing, the belief that no one will ever stand against them. If that belief breaks, their power breaks with it. And it is long past time for it to break. The call ended, and Danny turned to Katie. She was staring at the screen with wide eyes. Did that just happen? She asked. It did. The Drashan are helping us. Apparently. Over the next 6 days, the Drashan were not the only ones who answered the call. Word of humanity's refusal had spread across the galaxy like wildfire, carried by news channels, trade networks, and the quiet whispers of species who had spent centuries under the Council's thumb. The Fenari came first after the Drashan. They were an amphibian species, small and soft-spoken, known throughout the galaxy for their engineering genius. They had no love for war, but they had spent generations watching the Council dismiss their innovations and their contributions. They sent 12 ships, small but packed with technology so advanced that a single Fenari corvette could outperform most cruisers in the Council fleet. The Jokari came next. They were nomads, a wandering people with no home planet, who traveled the spaces between star systems in vast caravan fleets. The Council had treated them as second-class citizens for centuries, denying them permanent territory and forcing them to pay fees for passage through Council-controlled lanes. They sent 20 fast scout ships that could outrun anything in the galaxy. Then the Morathi, the gelatinous beings who had sat in the Council chamber and turned orange with shock when Hadley spoke his refusal. A faction of Morathi, younger and angrier than their elders, broke with their government, and sent 3 medical frigates to the corridor. It was a small gesture, but it carried enormous symbolic weight. The Morathi had been among the Council's most loyal members for thousands of years. Their defection, even a partial one, sent shockwaves through Nexus Prime. And there were others, a group of Halani traders who diverted their supply ships to keep the human colonies fed. A retired Veccan admiral who showed up in a battered old cruiser and said he wanted to die doing something that mattered. A Krythani scientist who broadcast an open letter condemning the Council's ruling as scientifically and ethically indefensible. By the time the Council fleet reached the corridor's outer boundary, they were not looking at 46 human ships. They were looking at a combined fleet of 138 vessels from 7 different species, arranged in a defensive formation that stretched across the corridor's main approach like a wall built from defiance and determination. Admiral Briggs, watching from Earth, felt something he had not allowed himself to feel since this crisis began: pride. He opened a channel that would be heard by every ship on both sides of the line. This is Fleet Admiral Nolan Briggs of the United Earth Navy, speaking on behalf of the Korath Corridor Defense Coalition. We are not here to start a war. We are not here to threaten anyone. We are here because 800,000 people have the right to live in the homes they built with their own hands. And because the 7 species standing behind this line believe that the galaxy deserves better than blind obedience. He paused. If you cross this line, you will be met with force. Not out of hatred, not out of anger, but because some things are worth defending. That is not a threat. That is a truth. The Council fleet reached the boundary and stopped. For the first time in 9,000 years, the Galactic Council's authority had run into something it could not simply push aside. It had run into a wall of beings who had decided, together, that enough was enough, and the galaxy held its breath. Humans shock the Galactic Council by rejecting negotiation. Part 5. A New Equation. The 2 fleets faced each other across a stretch of empty space that was barely 1,000 kilometers wide. On one side, the Council's enforcement armada, 247 warships drawn from 14 species, their hulls painted in the silver and blue of Council authority. On the other side, the ragged, mismatched wall of the Korath Corridor Defense Coalition, 138 ships of 7 species, held together not by tradition or law, but by something far harder to break. For 6 days, nothing happened, and those 6 days were the most dangerous days in the history of the galaxy. On the Steadfast, Captain Danny Hargrove barely slept. He rotated between the bridge, the tactical center, and his quarters, catching 30-minute naps when his body refused to keep going, and then dragging himself back to the command chair with another cup of coffee. Katie Pruitt ran the ship when he was down, and she did it well, but Danny could not stay away for long. Every minute felt like a coin flip. One nervous weapons officer on either side. One misread sensor blip. One ship drifting too close to the invisible line between the fleets. And the whole thing would go up in fire. War leader Kesson kept his Drashan ships in the center of the coalition line, the most dangerous position, the point where any attack would hit first. Danny had tried to argue that the humans should take the center, since it was their fight, but Kesson had refused. "Your species started this," the old warrior had said, his amber eye glowing in the dim light of the communication screen. "But it is no longer just your fight. The Drashan do not hide behind others. We stand at the front, or we do not stand at all." Danny had not argued again. On Earth, Admiral Briggs spent those 6 days in a state of controlled tension that he kept hidden from everyone except General Holt. The two of them met privately each evening in his office, going over the numbers, the scenarios, the possible outcomes. None of them were good. If the Council attacked, the coalition fleet would fight hard. But 138 ships against 247 was not a battle anyone wanted to fight. The Fenari technology would help. The Jokari speed would help. The Drashan willingness to take damage and keep coming would help. But help was not the same as enough. "If it comes to a fight," Holt said on the 4th evening, "we can hold them for maybe 3 days. After that, our losses will be too heavy to maintain the line." 3 days, Briggs repeated. "Maybe 4 if the Fenari shield generators hold up as well as they claim." Briggs was quiet for a long time. Then he said, 3 days might be enough." "Enough for what?" "Enough for the galaxy to see what the Council is willing to do. Enough for every species watching this to understand what happens when you stand up, and what happens when you're knocked down. Even if we lose the corridor, if the galaxy sees the Council destroy a coalition of 7 species over a 600-year-old travel route, the Council's moral authority dies. And that matters more than any piece of space." Holt studied him. "You're hoping we won't have to fight. I'm hoping the Council is smart enough to realize the same thing I just said." On the 7th day, the communication console on the Steadfast lit up with a priority signal. It was not from the Council fleet. It was from Nexus Prime, directly from the office of High Arbiter Zorath. He was requesting a private channel with Ambassador Hadley. Hadley was aboard the Steadfast, having refused to return to Earth while the standoff continued. He took the call in the ship's small conference room. Danny and Katie stood outside the door and waited. Zorath's image appeared on the screen. He looked different. The silver glow of his skin was dimmer, and his 6 eyes were heavy. He looked tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. He looked like someone whose certainty had cracked. "Ambassador Hadley," Zorath said. "High Arbiter," Hadley replied. He kept his voice neutral, but his heart was beating fast. 7 species, Zorath said quietly. 7 species standing against the Council. In 9,000 years, I would have told you this was impossible. And yet here we are. "Here we are," Hadley agreed. Zorath was silent for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different. The formal authority was gone. What remained was something raw and almost personal. "I have served as High Arbiter for 62 years. In that time, I have overseen hundreds of mediations. I have resolved border disputes, trade conflicts, and cultural disagreements between species that had nothing in common except their willingness to sit at the table. I believed, truly believed, that the Council system was the best way to maintain peace, that the rules, even when they seemed harsh, served the greater good." He paused. "Your ambassador's words in the chamber have kept me awake for many nights. You said that compliance is not the same as peace. You said that silence is not the same as consent. I have been turning those words over in my mind, and I find that I cannot dismiss them. High Arbiter, we never wanted to tear the Council apart. That was never the goal. I know, Zorath said. That is what makes this so difficult. If you were simply rebels or aggressors, the path would be clear. We would send the fleet and end the matter. But you are not aggressors. You are people defending their homes. And the species standing with you are not criminals. They are civilizations that have carried grievances against the Council for centuries and never had the courage to voice them. He looked directly into the screen. You have broken something, Ambassador. The question is whether what comes next will be better or worse than what came before. Hadley chose his next words carefully. High Arbiter, the Council has done remarkable things. You have prevented wars that would have killed billions. You have connected species that would never have found each other. That legacy is real, and it matters. But a system that was built 9,000 years ago cannot remain unchanged forever. Species grow, circumstances change. The rules have to change with them. What are you proposing? Zorath asked. Reform, Hadley said. Real reform. Give every species a genuine voice in council decisions, not just a seat in the chamber. Change the mediation process so that rulings are based on negotiation between equals, not predetermined outcomes. Create an appeals process. Allow counter-proposals. Let the galaxy be governed by consensus instead of compliance. Many on the council will resist this, Zorath said. Of course they will. Change is hard. But the alternative is what you see in the Korath corridor right now, a standoff that could turn into a war that nobody wants. And if it does turn into a war, even if the Council wins, you will lose. Because the galaxy will see what the Council is willing to do to maintain control, and every species will remember. Zorath closed his eyes, all 6 of them, at once. It was a Vellani expression that Hadley had never seen before, and he did not know what it meant. When Zorath opened them again, there was something new in them. And the Tarathi? Zorath asked. Their claim is genuine, even if you disagree with how the Council has handled it. Then the Tarathi and humanity will work it out between ourselves, Hadley said, as equals, without the Council's hand on the scale. And if we cannot reach an agreement on our own, we will invite a neutral mediator, someone both sides trust, to help us find a solution. A real solution, not a ruling handed down from above. Zorath studied him for a long time. Then he made a sound that the translator struggled with, before settling on something close to a weary laugh. You are a stubborn species, Zorath said. We prefer determined, Hadley said, with a small smile. I will take your proposal to the full Council Assembly, Zorath said. I will argue for it. I cannot promise the outcome. The old ways have deep roots, and there are many who would rather fight than change. We understand, Hadley said. And whatever happens, I want you to know that humanity respects you, High Arbiter, personally. This conversation took courage. Zorath's skin flickered with a pattern of light that the translator could not decode, but Hadley thought it might have been something close to gratitude. The channel closed. 3 days later, the Council fleet began to withdraw from the Korath corridor. Not all at once, and not quickly, but ship by ship, formation by formation, the Great Armada turned and moved away. It was not a retreat. The Council would never call it a retreat. It was a repositioning pending further deliberation, according to the official statement. But everyone knew what it really was. On the bridge of the Steadfast, Danny Hargrove watched the red dots disappear from his sensor display one by one. Katie Pruitt stood beside him, and for the first time in weeks, she was smiling. Think they'll actually reform? She asked. Danny leaned back in his chair. Maybe not all at once. But the door is open now, and once a door like that opens, it's hard to close. He sat there for a moment, looking at the stars through the forward viewport. Somewhere behind him, spread across the corridor, were 12 colonies full of people who would sleep safely tonight. Families, who would wake up tomorrow in the homes they had built. Children who would go to school on worlds their parents had made livable. 800,000 lives that the galaxy had tried to erase and couldn't. Send a message to the fleet, he said. Tell everyone to stand down from battle stations. And send a message to the colonies. Tell them the corridor is secure. Katie nodded and walked to the comm station. Danny looked at the display one more time. The Coalition ships were still out there. Drashan, Fenari, Jakari, Morathi, and the others, holding formation alongside the human fleet. 7 species that had been strangers a month ago, now bound together by something stronger than treaties or trade agreements. Bound by the simple fact that they had stood together when it counted. He thought about what Hadley had said to Zorath, that compliance was not peace, that silence was not consent, that the galaxy deserved better. It was not over. Danny knew that. The council would deliberate for months, maybe years. There would be setbacks and arguments and species that fought against change with everything they had. The Tarathi still needed to be dealt with. The sanctions would take time to lift. The coalition would need to hold together through all of it. And coalitions were fragile things that could shatter at the first sign of trouble. But for now, in this moment, humanity had done something no species had done in 9,000 years. They had looked the most powerful institution in the galaxy in the eye and said no. Not with anger, not with arrogance, but with the quiet, steady certainty of people who knew what they were fighting for and refused to let it go. The stars stretched out ahead of the steadfast, cold and bright and full of possibility. Danny Hargrove sat in his chair, took a long, slow breath, and allowed himself, just for a moment, to feel something that had been buried under weeks of fear and tension and sleepless nights. It felt a lot like hope. Behind him the corridor was quiet. The colonies were safe, and somewhere, on 300 different worlds, species that had spent centuries obeying without question were beginning to whisper a word they had almost forgotten existed. No. It was a small word, but it was enough to change everything. Humans shock the Galactic Council by rejecting negotiation. Part 1. The Summons. The Galactic Council had ruled the stars for 9,000 years. 312 species sat in its great chamber, and every single one of them had learned the same lesson at some point in their history. When the Council called, you answered. When the Council told you to give something up, you gave it up. When the Council said the matter was settled, the matter was settled. That was how things worked. That was how things had always worked. No one had ever said no. Captain Danny Hargrove was drinking his second cup of coffee on the bridge of the USS Steadfast when the transmission came through. The ship was a Valor-class heavy cruiser, one of the toughest vessels in Earth's fleet, currently running a patrol route along the outer edge of the Korath corridor. It was a quiet Tuesday, or at least it had been. The holographic display flickered, and the image of High Arbiter Zorath appeared. He was Vellani, tall and thin, with smooth silver skin that seemed to glow from within. 6 eyes sat arranged in a circle around the top of his long skull, and each one of them carried the kind of calm authority that came from knowing you had never lost an argument in your entire life. Species designation, human, Zorath said through the translator. His voice was flat, almost bored. You have been formally summoned to the Galactic Council chamber on Nexus Prime. Your recent expansion into the Korath corridor has been classified as a territorial violation under Section 47 of the Interstellar Accord. You will present yourselves for negotiation within 30 standard rotations. Failure to appear will be treated as an act of aggression. The screen went dark. He stared at the blank display for a few seconds, then turned to his executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Katie Pruitt, who was standing with her arms folded and one eyebrow raised high enough to touch her hairline. "Well," she said, "that was friendly." Danny didn't smile. He pulled up the star chart on the main screen and zoomed into the Korath corridor. It was a wide stretch of space between two dead nebulae, and humanity had been settling it for the past 11 years. 12 colony ships had gone out there. Mining stations were pulling rare metals from asteroid belts. Agricultural teams were turning lifeless moons into farmland. Nearly 800,000 people lived in that corridor now. Families, children, people who had left everything behind on Earth to build something new. And now, the Council wanted them gone. "Get me a secure channel to Fleet Admiral Nolan Briggs at High Command," Danny said, "and send a priority message to Ambassador Luke Hadley. Tell him to stop whatever he's doing and read this transmission." On Earth, deep inside a mountain complex that served as the headquarters for humanity's combined military command, Admiral Briggs sat at the head of a long table and read the Council's message 3 times. He was a big man, with a square jaw and gray hair cut short. The kind of officer who never raised his voice because he never had to. People listened to Briggs not because he was loud, but because he was usually right. He set the datapad down and looked around the room. General Megan Holt sat across from him, her arms crossed, her dark eyes hard. She commanded every soldier, marine, and combat pilot that Earth had stationed beyond the solar system. Next to her sat Ambassador Hadley, a thin man with tired eyes, who had spent the last 20 years trying to build bridges between humanity and the rest of the galaxy. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week, which was probably close to the truth. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," Briggs said. "The Council is telling us to pull 800,000 people out of their homes, shut down mining operations worth trillions, abandon 11 years of work, and hand everything over to a species called the Torathi, because their ancestors flew through that part of space 6 centuries ago." "That is an accurate summary, yes," Hadley said. "And they're calling this a negotiation." Hadley let out a small, humorless laugh. "The Council doesn't negotiate, Admiral. They never have. What they do is present you with their decision and give you the honor of agreeing to it. Every species that has ever been summoned before the Council has accepted the terms they were given. Every single one in 9,000 years. General Holt leaned forward. "What happens if a species says no?" Hadley replied. "No one has ever said no," Hadley replied. "That's not what I asked." Hadley paused and rubbed his eyes. The Council's enforcement protocol has 3 stages. First, economic sanctions. They cut you off from galactic trade. No more access to Council markets, transit lanes, or shared technology. Second, blockade. They surround your territory with warships and squeeze until you can't breathe. Third, if all else fails, military intervention. The combined fleet of the Council is the largest armed force in the galaxy. Over 10,000 warships from dozens of species. The room was very quiet. Briggs looked at Holt. Holt looked at Briggs. Something passed between them, the kind of silent conversation that only happened between people who had served together for a very long time. "Tell me about this Section 47, Briggs said. Hadley pulled up the relevant legal text on his datapad. Section 47 of the Interstellar Accord deals with ancestral territorial claims. It says that if a species can prove their ancestors occupied or transited through a region of space, they can file a claim to that region regardless of its current status. The Council reviews the claim, and if the historical evidence checks out, the current occupants are ordered to leave, regardless of how long they've been there," Holt said. "Regardless of what they've built, regardless of how many people live there, the older claim wins. That's the rule." Briggs stood up and walked to the window. The mountain complex didn't have real windows, but the display screens showed a feed from the surface. Snow was falling on the peaks above. Somewhere out there, past the atmosphere, past the solar system, past hundreds of light years of empty space, 800,000 human beings were living their lives in the Korath corridor, without any idea that the most powerful organization in the galaxy had just decided their homes didn't belong to them. He thought about his daughter, who had moved to one of those colonies 2 years ago with her husband and their baby girl. He thought about the pictures she sent him every week, the little house they had built, the garden she was trying to grow in alien soil. He turned back to the room. "Ambassador Hadley," he said, "I want you to lead a delegation to Nexus Prime. I want you to walk into that council chamber and look the High Arbiter in the eye." Hadley nodded slowly. "And what would you like me to say to him?" He folded his hands on the table and looked at every person in the room, one by one. "Tell him no." The word hung in the air like a gunshot. Hadley opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again. "Admiral, you understand what that means. No species has ever refused the council. We would be the first. The consequences could be catastrophic." "I understand the consequences," Briggs said, "and I understand something else. If we give up those colonies today, the council will come for something else tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that, because that's what happens when you let someone take from you without a fight. They learn that taking is easy, and they never stop." He looked at Holt. "General, begin moving defensive assets to the Korath corridor, quietly." Holt nodded and stood up. She was already making calculations in her head. Briggs looked at Hadley. "Ambassador, you have 30 days. Make them count." Hadley stared at him for a long moment. Then something changed in his tired eyes. Something hardened. Something that looked a lot like resolve. "Yes, sir," he said. And just like that, humanity decided to do what no species in 9,000 years had ever dared to do. They decided to say no to the Galactic Council. Not because they wanted a fight, not because they were reckless or arrogant or blind to the danger, but because 800,000 people had built homes in the stars, and some things were simply not for sale. The galaxy just didn't know it yet.